Welcome back to the channel, everybody. This is our 10-day senatorial election prediction video. It's been a long wait to get to this point, but here we are, only a week and change now away from the elections in November. There you see the map, 35 Democratic seats, 30 Republican seats. Pretty clearly, this state of these races are coming down to the wire. And I think you would imagine that the Democratic Party has a lot of enthusiasm going into this, but obviously they have a lot of seats to make up. As we know, the current Senate map is 53 to 47, meaning the Democrats again need to flip a net of 3 seats to reach the magic number. So let's get right into it. In the state of Alaska, the Democratic Party just can't quite break through here. We've seen some polls over time, even though it's a very difficult state to poll, and we haven't had that much polling in this state. The reality of the situation is the Democratic Party has had enough information here to, I think, it's reasonable for them to say, okay, maybe at the 11th hour here, we're going to pull out and really put our last, little blitz of funding into one of these real toss-up races. Now, that's not to say that Al Gross doesn't have a chance against Dan Sullivan, but if Al Gross was going to win purely from a polling standpoint, and again, we're not just blindly following the polls here, what we are doing is understanding, though, that's the best, indicator that we have of what these races are going to end up being. But in the state of Alaska, I think it's interesting to point out that what we have here is a state that, is very, very interested in electing independents and electing sort of maverick candidates up and down the ticket sometimes. So that's obviously a benefit for Al Gross, especially in a Democratic wave year. But again, the polling just doesn't really show that. So I'm only going to be able to label this lean for Dan Sullivan because we've seen some tight margins. A little bit tighter than the House race here with Dan Young and whatnot, but I think that Dan Sullivan's going to squeak this out. Now in Oregon, we know Jeff Merkley's going to be fine, just as we know Jim Risch in Idaho will be fine. All right, now in Arizona, this is basically the first major pickup opportunity, as we know, for the Democrats. Now, the reality of the situation is, I believe that Mark Kelly, the Democratic candidate here, is a little bit of a shoo-in at this point for this seat. Okay, there are only 10 days left, as we know. He has led the entire election season. Okay, he's led for over 150 days now in this seat. Martha McSally has never been able to turn this seat around for herself. Further complicating things for her, the state as a whole is not just very interested in electing Mark Kelly, it appears to be interested in electing Democrats. There are more Democrats in the U.S. House now from this state than there are Republicans. Which is one factor here. And another factor is that, of course, Martha McSally lost a Senate race 2 years ago when she was defeated by Kyrsten Sinema, who, as we know, even though she's very moderate policy-wise, demographically, that's not something you would expect to come out of a somewhat purple state. So that's kind of interesting to watch in the state of Arizona. And right now, Mark Kelly, at this point, appears to be a shoo-in. I'd be shocked if Martha McSally was able to somehow win this race. She's been thoroughly outraised, outspent, and outperformed in the polls. Interestingly enough, Mark Kelly has been outperforming Joe Biden pretty much throughout the campaign season, so it's interesting to see if this really ends up going their way. But I expect it to. So I'm going to go with a likely at this point now for Mark Kelly, and that's a one pickup for the Democrats. Now, in the state of Montana, such an interesting state for so many different reasons. Obviously, we know what it does on the presidential level, but this is a rare year in the state of Montana because there is a Senate race, a governor race, and the lone House race here is up. Now, obviously, the House race is up every 2 years, and it's usually a pretty competitive seat. No matter who the incumbent is, the opposite party is generally, always fielding a real candidate for it. At this moment, Kathleen Williams, the Democrat, has just a very small lead in the House race here. And that would be a good result for the Democrats because, obviously, look, the Republicans are not going to flip the House this time around. We know that. But say the Democrats sweep the election. Okay, they win the White House back and they win the Senate back. Usually the party that has the White House, if they have the House at the same time, they're very vulnerable. So sometimes losing Sometimes the party that has the House and the White House, that's when they're most vulnerable on losing the House. So if the Democrats are able to pick up a couple seats, they would make it that much tougher a lift for the Republicans in 3, 4 years. And also, it never hurts for the majority party just to add a couple seats anyway, just as it wouldn't hurt the minority, even if they don't flip it altogether. Just to add a seat or two would be very helpful. So that's a good sign for the Democrats there. But what's strange is that the current House member is Greg Gianforte, and he is relinquishing his seat to run for governor. And he's currently leading Mike Cooney. There was a poll that came out just today that had Mike Cooney ahead, or I'm sorry, behind Greg Gianforte. So it's interesting, right? How you can be the seat that you're giving up, you could be seeing that seat flip from one party to the other, but you could also be leading in the new seat that you're running for. So all this is to set up the fact that right now Steve Bullock, who's the incumbent governor, is running against Steve Daines. Now, Bullock got out to an early lead against Daines. We saw one poll right away that had him up by 7 points, another that had him up by 3, but Daines has slowly turned this race around. Okay, there's been a ton of money thrown into this race. Now, let's not forget that voters in this state absolutely love Steve Bullock. He is the most liked politician of either party in the state of Montana. And don't forget, in 2016, he was up for re-election. Okay, voters in Montana voted for Trump by over 20 points. They easily re-elected Steve Bullock. Not a lot of straight ticket voters there. Okay, and this is a state that also re-elected Jon Tester. Now, it was a little narrow, but they did re-elect him back in 2018. And remember, this is still a state that has not had a Republican governor since the year 2000. Okay, so it's very interesting to see that Steve Bullock definitely has a real shot at winning this seat. But again, the polling just shows that Steve Daines has a very slight edge here. I would expect Steve Bullock to tap out right around 48%. We're not going to talk about Wyoming, but in Colorado, this is kind of similar to Arizona. In fact, I would say it's even more likely for the Democrats than Arizona. Let's break down the dynamics of this race here. First of all, Cory Gardner was always going to be a little bit vulnerable, an incumbent to begin with. He won back in 2014 in a big Republican wave year. So even in a good year for the GOP, this is going to be a tough retention for them. But at this point, everything has broken the Democratic Party's way. First of all, they fielded the best candidate that they could have, and that being John Hickenlooper, who briefly ran for president. But John Hickenlooper, as we know, is kind of similar to Steve Bullock. He's sort of a moderate Democrat who's very, very well liked in his state. And, Colorado, as we know, has shifted further and further to the left in recent years, to the point where even when Hickenlooper left, they were able to replace him with Jared Polis, who's the first openly gay governor, and politically he's also definitely to the left of Hickenlooper. So Hickenlooper shifted gears after dropping out, and now is going to be, in all likelihood, the next senator from Colorado. Polling has been consistent for Hickenlooper. He has thoroughly outraised Cory Gardner. And basically the last nail in the coffin was that both the Republican senatorial RNSC and the Democratic equivalent, they both stopped spending money in this state on this race. So both sides know what the outcome is going to be here. Cory Gardner at this point is probably already looking for his next job. So I cannot stress enough how I think this is a pretty likely pickup, I think, for the Democrats. Again, you can't ever really label a safe state for the new party, but you can think of it that way, honestly, in this state. Now, in New Mexico, this is an open seat, but Ben Ray Lujan looks like he's going to be just fine. We haven't seen any indication that Ron Chetty, the Republican, is going to upstage him in this state. I'd be shocked if Ben Ray Lujan didn't pull this out. Now, in South Dakota, this is always a state to kind of watch in statewide races because sometimes the Democratic Party can make some real inroads here. But that's not going to happen this time for whatever reason. Mike Rounds, the Republican incumbent senator, and of course Donald Trump will be fine, as will Ben Sasse in the state of Nebraska. Let me get a sip of water here. Okay, now in the state of Kansas, obviously on the presidential level, it's not really anything worth talking about, but this has been an interesting state to watch over the last 2 years, because this was, of course, the state that bred Chris Kobach, who ran for governor unsuccessfully in 2018. He was very closely aligned with Donald Trump, and he shockingly lost to Laura Kelly. Now, of course, I think the Democrats will be the first to tell you that 2018, it wasn't really the dream night that they were hoping for. They flipped the House. They flipped 40 seats. That's good. That's a very good result for them. Um, and the problem was, though, they got whooped in the Senate. Okay, they lost in Florida, they lost in Missouri, they lost in North Dakota, and they lost in Indiana. That's four incumbencies that they dropped. They did get two of them back when they flipped Nevada and Arizona. But the best part of the night for the Democrats was the governorships. They did a great job there. They flipped Nevada, they flipped Kansas, Wisconsin, Michigan, Maine, Illinois. Okay, that's a pretty good result for them on the gubernatorial level. But the other reason I think that they didn't have the quote unquote sort of dream night was because some of the big national and emotional races for either side, the Republicans won. Beto O'Rourke in Texas, Brian Kemp in Georgia, the two races in Florida, Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott. So that's kind of why that night was a little bit underwhelming if you're a Democrat. But Kansas was kind of a bright spot, sort of an unexpected bright spot where you sort of got a surprise governor elected in Kansas. Now, Kobach gave it another shot in the primary for Senate and lost to Roger Marshall. Now, I do understand that polling in this state has been close. It's been mostly within 5 points. Barbara Bollier is a good candidate for the Democrats, a state senator, a former Republican, so maybe there's some constituency overlap there. But I kind of have to believe this to see it a little bit, because I think in the Laura Kelly race, Chris Kobach was such a despicable character for both parties. And that's just not who Roger Marshall is. Roger Marshall's a more traditional family values Republican, and so I'm only going to label this lean because of the polling. But I think at the end of the day, Roger Marshall's going to be okay. Jim Inhofe is not in any trouble here. Now in Texas, this has gotten away from the Democrats a little bit. There was a lot of enthusiasm, at least at first, about MJ Hager. Now she's basically the same candidate as Amy McGrath up in Kentucky. The Democrats thought that she could really challenge John Cornyn, but this is not 2 years ago. Okay, Beto O'Rourke gave Ted Cruz every last thing he could handle, came pretty close to defeating him in 2018. MJ Hager is not going to defeat John Cornyn. Okay, here's a fascinating polling result that just came out. The Dallas Morning News, which is an extremely reliable pollster, had Joe Biden leading Donald Trump by 3%, and John Cornyn in the same poll leading MJ Hager by 8%. What does that tell you? There are a lot of deserters. But most of them still, attach themselves to John Cornyn. And so that is pretty interesting from a standpoint of, how are these races going to unfold? And I think at the end of the day, even this is going to be a little closer to the gubernatorial race that we saw in 2018 when Greg Abbott thoroughly defeated Lupe Valdez. So I'm going to label this likely more from a likelihood characterization than a margin. Now, Tina Smith in Minnesota is probably going to be able to edge this out without too much of a difficulty. You can't really say that this is a safe retention for the Democrats quite yet, just because polling has been just close enough. And of course, this has been kind of a frequent trend in Minnesota where the second senator, the junior senator, has always had more trouble than Amy Klobuchar. Amy Klobuchar can win very, very easily. She did back in 2018. It was a very easy win for her. And of course, ran for president. We get the whole thing. Whereas Tina Smith is obviously not nearly as well known. She's not as established a figure. She hasn't been on TV all the time at the Judiciary Committee hearings. You get the point. So Tina Smith at this point, I would be shocked if she lost. Remember, this is a state in which the Democrats swept in the midterms, winning the governorship back and both Senate seats. So I expect Tina Smith. One of those, of course, was Tina Smith. So I expect her to get her first full 6-year term, and I'm going to label it likely. Okay, now in the state of Iowa, a very elastic state, as we know. The Democrats have 3 of the 4 House seats in this state, the fourth being up here in the northwest portion of the state that for years was controlled by Steve King. We know what happened there. But right now, Teresa Greenfield has the edge over Joni Ernst. Joni Ernst had a pretty, for lack of a better term, she was embarrassed at the most recent debate between those two when the two candidates were asked about the price of a bushel of corn. Theresa Greenfield was swiftly able to deliver a correct response, and Joni Ernst did not know the answer, um, and then was given a second try by the moderator, and basically said, "Nah, I'm good." So that definitely was not good for her. She's been outspent. She's been outraised by Greenfield. Greenfield, for over the last month, definitely took the upper hand, but in the last 2 weeks, which I know that didn't make sense. I would say maybe over the last 6 weeks, Theresa Greenfield has the upper hand, but in the last 10 to 12 days, Ernst has been making a comeback. So it's very interesting that all of a sudden, once the debates were really kicking off, maybe that had something to do with Ernst's resurgence, even though, at least to me, it looked like Theresa Greenfield was way ahead after those debate performances. If we look at the most recent polling, Greenfield has the lead, so we'll go with her. So +3, -1, -6, then -4, -1, +6, +2, tie, +5, +4, +4. So, over the last couple of weeks, as I said, Ernst is making a comeback. But again, this is a huge Democratic wave here. Joni Ernst is not very popular in that state. This isn't 2014. Okay, the Republicans had a ridiculous wave year in 14. That's not what's happening here. Okay, this is kind of the Democratic Party's time. This is a favorable map for them. It's not as favorable as it will be in 22, but this is no doubt favorable for them. Okay, so let's keep an eye on that. I expect Iowa to flip for the Democrats and Theresa Greenfield giving them their third flip of the night. Arkansas, we're not going to talk about it. There's no Democratic incumbent or candidate, and neither in Louisiana up until very recently. Now in Mississippi, Mike Espy's trying again against Cindy Hyde-Smith. Cindy Hyde-Smith, as we know, was embroiled in some controversy when she won that special election a few years back against Mike Espy. And she won it by a mere 8%. But the fact of the matter is, that was the time when there was a lot of controversy. I do not really think Mike Espy has any reason to believe he's going to win this time around. It was interesting to see that the Lincoln Project actually took some ads out in this state around Mike Espy. Now, the final result totals, I think, might actually be pretty close from what they were in that special election because, again, Democratic wave here, but we do know that in this election, minority turnout's going to be high. We're already seeing that in the early vote totals. And so what's interesting is, of course, Mike Espy, we know he's a black candidate, and this is the highest minority population state in the country. So obviously there's going to be some high turnout, but I'd be shocked if Cindy Hyde-Smith didn't pull this out. Now in Alabama, there's been just kind of a last-minute glimmer of hope for Doug Jones here. He did win one poll here. I forget the pollster, but by only 1 percentage point. His campaign has been pleading with the Democratic senatorial committees and all that to jump into this race. They have been very hesitant to, and I think they've made the right decision. Just because, let's be honest, they have too many good pickup opportunities elsewhere. And even though the current map has it at 53 to 47, I think both sides really should be thinking about this as 54-46. Because, look, at the end of the day, do we really expect Doug Jones to win again? I'd be shell-shocked if he did that. I think that would be an even bigger upset than what Heidi Heitkamp was able to pull off a couple election cycles ago. So I expect Tommy Tuberville to flip this seat for the Republicans. All right, very interesting state here in Georgia. Let's talk about the general election first. Now, Jon Ossoff, as we know, the Democratic candidate, was at the center of the most expensive House race in U.S. history a couple years back during the first year of Trump's term. That was kind of a disappointing result for the Democrats when he lost that race. He's now, of course, running for Senate here. Another big fundraiser. I'll say this about Jon Ossoff. He absolutely has the fundraising game going. And this part of the country as well. It's just done so well between him and Jamie Harrison. Polling has steadily shown David Perdue, the incumbent Republican, slightly ahead of Ossoff, though we've seen some polls that aren't necessarily one-offs at this point because we've seen enough of them that have Ossoff leading by 1-2%. And recently, David Perdue at a Trump rally we know the story by now, did the whole Kamala, that whole sort of racist imitation or whatever exactly it was, the intentional mispronouncing of her name. And so within 24 hours, the Ossoff campaign raised over $2 million. Okay, so don't be surprised if Ossoff wins this race. The Democrats have always had a hard time in this state. They usually, again, sort of peter out right around 48, 49%. So I expect this. I think Ossoff is going to come up just short, but kind of like Montana, don't be surprised at all if he pulls this out. Now, the special election is really fascinating because Raphael Warnock, for a long time, the Reverend, was kind of in the dumps a little bit. It just really wasn't able to get anywhere near first or second place. This is a jungle system, as we know, the representative Doug Collins. There's also Kelly Loeffler in the middle of this, along with Warnock. Now, the other Democratic candidates have either dropped out or have just completely fallen out of favor altogether. Now, Barack Obama changed this race. He got in the race and endorsed Raphael Warnock. And since then, the support around Warnock has consolidated. Warnock has been in first place in most of the jungle primary polling. He is not going to get 50%, though, as we know, so he's going to have to advance to a runoff. He would hope it's against Kelly Loeffler, who, as we know, is facing charges of insider trading. Doug Collins, I think, would be a tougher beat for him. Right now, I think at the end of the day, what we've seen over the course of primary elections in the past across the country is that the Republicans are better at consolidating their support amongst several candidates than the Democrats are. So that's why I'm going to change the characterization back to tilt Republican. Now, we have to talk about South Carolina, obviously, because Jamie Harrison is continuing to shatter fundraising records. Even though he has basically more money than he knows what to do with at this point, he is still raking in millions in donations. Of course, raised $58 million in that third quarter, which was a shattering record. Lindsey Graham has repeatedly gone on Fox News and basically begged for money at this point. He's just pleading with voters to help him out. He's getting crazy outspent. Now, there have been some major interests that have jumped in here kind of at the last minute to try to boost him and to save him. It will probably be enough, but Lindsey Graham is definitely on election night. There's definitely going to be a few hours where he is not sure that he has won this race quite yet. Remember, the gubernatorial race between Henry McMaster and James Smith, that was relatively close. Okay, it was 54 to 46. And there wasn't quite, there wasn't nearly as much enthusiasm about that race as there will be about this one. And Jamie Harrison did lead in the most recent poll by 2 points in a highly rated pollster. And so the reality of the situation is South Carolina is very much in play for the Democrats. They have put this one on the map. This isn't like Kentucky or Texas, that they're just kind of formalities at this point. The reality of the situation is, I would give Jamie Harrison about a 25 to 30% chance of winning this seat. Okay, I'd be a little surprised, but at the end of the day, a Democratic wave year, Lindsey Graham is not liked within his own state, and Jamie Harrison is about as energizing a candidate as we've ever seen on the senatorial level. So I'm going to downgrade this to a tilt for Lindsey Graham. Bill Hagerty is going to be fine in Tennessee. Now, the sexting scandal involving Cal Cunningham here in North Carolina does not appear to have hurt him. His lead has shrunk just a little bit, but he still has the lead. And so that, to me, is a sign that his lead was big enough. And remember, let's not forget either that a lot of people have already voted. Okay, so if this had come out in March or in June or something, then that might have been different, but a lot of people have voted. Okay, a lot of donations have obviously already been made. Cunningham has also, like Jamie Harrison, raised a ton of money. So there's, what we understand is that I just don't think it's going to move the needle that much. There are probably, a couple thousand maybe voters that have sort of reconsidered things, but are all few thousand of them going to change their vote altogether or not vote, period? I can't really see that happening. So Cunningham still has the edge here. He's led throughout the campaign season, and at the same time, Tillis's ability to kind of pounce on that was compromised because of his positive COVID test. So I would expect Cal Cunningham to still pull this out, and I'm going to label it lean. We know that Dick Durbin is going to be fine in Illinois, whereas I think Amy McGrath, she gave it a good shot. I think she'll get 41, maybe 42%, but Mitch McConnell is going to be just fine, just as Shelley Moore Capito will be in West Virginia and Mark Warner in Virginia. Okay, now in Michigan. The Democrats, I think, have reason to be a little concerned about this race. John James is giving it another shot, this time against Gary Peters. Now, James is a good candidate. Okay, he's a black candidate, which is, you don't find too many of those in the GOP. He tried against Debbie Stabenow 2 years ago. Stabenow beat him by about 5-6 points. So that's not a lot. So he doesn't need to pull off too many voters. The only thing is, though, again, I mean, are voters really shifting to the GOP right now? No, they're not. They're shifting to the Democrats, as was evidenced in this state by the fact that, yes, Stabenow won, and they flipped the governorship here when Gretchen Whitmer defeated Bill Schuette. It was albeit an open seat, but it's still a flip. Michigan, I fully expect, as my presidential election prediction videos have shown, to go over to Joe Biden on the presidential level. So, by and large, I think John James is a very good candidate, but I can't quite see him edging this out. I'm going to label this lean for Gary Peters. Okay, now in Delaware, I fully expect Chris Coons to win, as will Cory Booker, as will Jack Reed, and Ed Markey in Massachusetts. Now, in New Hampshire, this is a state that, as you can see now, control for the Senate is up for grabs at 49 apiece. As New Hampshire is one of those states that the Republican Party can be very, very competitive in. Of course, they have the governorship here. They had a senator here up until 2016. It was the closest state on the 2016 presidential level. And it's a very interesting state to watch in 2 years' time when Maggie Hassan is up for re-election. So keep an eye on that. But right now, they failed to nominate a real candidate for this seat, and that's why Jeanne Shaheen is going to be just fine. Polling has shown her to be thoroughly in control. Remember, the VP nod is also going to the Democrats right now. We managed to get that fixed. All right. Lastly, in Maine, Susan Collins, I think time has run out on her. We have said throughout the election season on this channel that the fact that she was only narrowly behind Sarah Gideon, I think, spells good news for her, and that eventually maybe she can pull through. But time has run out. She has not been able to overcome that. She has not been able to break through. And I think at this point, it's pretty clear that Sarah Gideon has the upper hand. I'd be at this point pretty surprised. And I think the final nail in the coffin for her was that Jared Golden up here in the northern portion of the state, which is really where Susan Collins has to run up the numbers. He is really, really easily running away with his reelection up there, which I think kind of solidifies this for Sarah Gideon. I'm going to label this lean for her. So there's your map, 51-49, 5 pickups for the Democrats: Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, Maine, and Iowa. So let's go through all the winners as we always do. Dan Sullivan wins in Alaska, Jeff Merkley in Oregon. Jim Risch wins in Idaho, and Mark Kelly with a pickup for the Democrats in Arizona. Steve Daines outlasts Steve Bullock in Montana. Mike Enzi wins in Wyoming, while John Hickenlooper is able to win in Colorado over Cory Garner, and Ben Ray Lujan holds the open seat for the Democrats. Mike Rounds wins in South Dakota, Ben Sass in Nebraska. Barbara Bollier comes up short against Roger Marshall in Kansas. Jim Inhofe cruises to another 6 years in Oklahoma, and John Cornyn defeats MJ Hager in Texas. Tina Smith wins in Minnesota. Teresa Greenfield just edges it out over Joni Ernst. Tom Cotton defeats an independent in Arkansas, while Bill Cassidy, fresh off his positive COVID diagnosis, wins in Louisiana. Cindy Hyde-Smith again defeats Mike Espy. Tommy Tuberville unseats Democratic incumbent Doug Jones. David Perdue survives against Jon Ossoff, while either Doug Collins or Kelly Loeffler at this moment in time consolidates enough support to defeat Raphael Warnock. Lindsey Graham survives against Jamie Harrison, while Bill Hagerty cruises to another win in Tennessee. Cal Cunningham is able to eke it out despite his scandalous affairs in North Carolina. Dick Durbin will be just fine in Illinois. Mitch McConnell survives again for another 6 years in Kentucky. Shelley Moore Capito easily wins re-election in West Virginia, just as Mark Warner does in Virginia. Gary Peters, through some what of a nail-biter, is able to defeat John James in Michigan, while Chris Coons, Cory Booker, Jack Reed, and Ed Markey all easily win re-elections up here. Jeanne Shaheen is able to defeat Kelly Ayotte in New Hampshire. And lastly, Sarah Gideon defeats Susan Collins to give the Democrats 51 seats to the Republicans 49. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please comment down the suggestions below. Hit the subscribe button if you have not already, and the like button. We're going to be coming out with our 9-day presidential and senatorial election predictions very soon, so stay tuned for that. So thank you guys again so much for watching, and I'll see you in November.